This is the Annex, a Sociology podcast. I'm Dan Morrison from the University of Alabama in Huntsville. Today, a unique episode where I am joined by two guests, Dr. Dwaine Plaza, Professor of Sociology at Oregon State University, and Dr. Regan Gurung, Professor of Psychology and former Associate Vice Provost and Executive Director of the Center for Teaching and Learning at Oregon State. These two scholars edited the new book, Higher Education Beyond COVID, New Teaching Paradigms and Promise, published in 2024 by Routledge. Our conversation was recorded on March 19th, 2024. Dwaine and Regan, welcome to the Annex.
Thanks, Dan.
Thank you, Dan.
All right, well, I'm going to have you all introduce yourselves briefly till we get your voices down, since there's more than two people on our podcast here. So I'll ask the first question, if you could introduce yourself as you answer. Okay, so your book has two major sections. The first section includes 5 chapters that contain overviews of what we know about college and university responses to the COVID-19 pandemic and its effects on teaching, learning, faculty, administration, and students. And the second section of 17 chapters are from authors working in a range of institutions and from a diverse set of perspectives. Clearly, we don't have time to go into each chapter, but I wanted to start not at the beginning of the pandemic, but in the present. What's your sense of how faculty at your institution are dealing with the longer-term effects of this ongoing, challenging pandemic situation that we're in?
So I'll begin by saying, Dan, it's been a roller coaster for a lot of faculty, in the sense that we've got some faculty who are back in the classroom, who are trying to actually use some of the practices they developed during COVID and doing a kind of a hybrid model. We've got other faculty who literally just shut down, and they're still in the COVID fog, if you want to look at it that way. And then you got other faculty kind of in between. So we've got innovators, we've got people who are kind of, stuck in a paradigm that says, I want everything to go back the way it was, and I want the students to go back to the way it was. And that's another constituency that we need to think about here too, is the students had a model that worked for some, didn't work at all for others. But again, there were some who had the in-between. And so we're trying to negotiate with those students also. So it's kind of in that, I believe we're in that transition period where likely we'll come out of this, where there's going to be a new kind of hybrid model in all of this that's going to be more effective than we've ever had before. And I'll turn it over to Regan.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, Dan, because as a psychologist, we try to understand and predict behavior. And even in my intro classes, my mantra from day one onwards is behavior is complex, right? And behavior is complex. And when we look at how faculty behavior, and I'm going to stick with faculty for a second, for a first bit, faculty behavior really changed dramatically. There was the emergency remote teaching. And when I look at it right now, and at the Center for Teaching and Learning, we work a lot with faculty, right? Where we're interacting with faculty a lot, we're hearing from them a lot. And, to add to what Dwaine said about these different categories, what's really interesting is how dramatically faculty have adjusted their day-to-day behaviors. And I say day-to-day behaviors. There are so many faculty who have really adopted more of this, more of a remote mindset in terms of even meetings, right? I mean, I think Dwaine can attest to this. The number of meetings that faculty now attend remotely versus showing up, that's very high. I'm a face-to-face person. I love being there in the present. But I can understand how it's easier to hop onto one Zoom and then hop onto another. But that's one of the biggest changes that I've seen in faculty behavior, is the much higher likelihood to either not come to campus things to the extent that they used to, or try to get a Zoom link, right? So that's one element there. I think another element too is now, bridging the faculty student thing. Something that we're all dealing with is there's a clear-cut change in student expectation. And I say clear cut, and then as a data person, it's hard to pinpoint exactly the data. So to be clear, my clear cut is from teaching 300 and 400 people a term for the last 5 years. So, my large scale anecdote is there are some significant changes in student behavior that I think we're also dealing with. And I think there's one more last part, and we can unpack any of these later, but there's one more last part. It's not just us adapting to and changing behaviors due to the pandemic and post-pandemic. It's now just when we thought we were ready to go back to some kind of new thing, we're all jabbing, trading punches with AI.
Mm. Mm.
It's a fun challenge. I'm one of those optimists where I can see the affordances of AI, but add to the whole, our student behaviors are different from the pandemic. Now we get into, and how are they dealing with AI? So, wow, what an exciting time to be in higher education.
So exciting, Regan.
Oh, let me add one more constituent to all of this, and that's administrators.
Yeah.
And I say that because they were now, when we first came back, they were the ones who were adamant, let's go back to what we were doing before. I mean, they were on that. And as time has rolled on, I think what they've started to realize is that everybody around them has changed, because ironically, when you looked at when the pandemic was actually unfolding, a lot of the administrators continued their job. We even had an individual, our provost, who literally went in every single day to his office and maintained a, let's call it beachhead from there. And everybody told him about it, that he was setting a bad example, but he continued it. I'm just saying there's that mentality that administrators came back with the idea that everything was going to go back the same way. And now they're slowly but surely realizing that they need to also go with the flow, in a sense. And let's figure out where the beachhead, let's figure out where that new norm is.
Yeah, I think the storytelling is really helpful. Regan, I wanted to follow up with your discussion of student behavior. So could you characterize for us what are the things that students are doing differently, or what changes in behavior have you noticed either through or then coming out of pandemic times?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the biggest one I've seen is the expectation that an in-person synchronous activity will be also available asynchronously and on Zoom. That's probably the biggest one, right? So many of us did that during emergency teaching. So many of us used some of those elements even when we came back into the classroom. And there are, I think, many students who will go, hey, could I still have that? Could I have a recording? Could I even have a live? I'm not feeling great today. Could I have the Zoom link for class? And I will tell you that I do record my lectures. I do make my class material available, recordings of, but not live. And that right there is one of my big changes since the pandemic, because I think, and again, I looked out at the data, and what the data suggests is that providing recordings is better for students on a number of different dimensions. It's not just so that they can skip class and have it, which is what some knee-jerk reactions are, but you've got to think about, what about the multilingual student? What about the international student? What about the student for who I just talk too fast, right? What about the student who takes a little bit longer time to process information? And from a cognitive science perspective, we know that's true. Some of us just take a little longer to process what we've heard. For all those reasons, having a recording of your lecture is a good idea, is a pedagogically sound idea. But for many students, because most of us did it during the heyday of the pandemic, there's that expectation of, oh, can I have it now? So that's one big change, is this expectation for recordings. Another change is the expectation of flexibility. Now, don't get me wrong, I aim to be a compassionate, flexible teacher, but I think the needle moved so far to the bend over backwards and twist into a pretzel, where the student expectation now was, wait a minute, you had no deadlines. The collective us had no deadlines. Why do you have deadlines? And of course, I cite the research once more. The research is pretty clear. Structure is important. Deadlines are important. Weekly deadlines in your classes are better for all students, and especially better or minoritized students, low income students, and so on and so forth. So all of that. But that's the other area that I've seen a change is this flexibility request. And there are some creative ways to deal with that, but that's a big expectation. The last one I'll mention is there's definitely a change in the extent to which people feel it's important to attend class, extent to which the average student turns things in on time. That there's been many more delays with that. And of course, I think tied to all of this, not maybe so much as an explanation, but clearly a dovetailing feature is the much greater, and I know Dwaine and I both teach some large classes, and maybe it's just a base rate issue, but just the number of students that I see, that I hear from, who will email and say, I just can't take it this week. I've had a really tough mental health week. I can't come to class. That definitely ticked up a few notches.
Yeah, to echo that, it's also the student who has a dental appointment all of a sudden that they didn't expect because an emergency happened, or that life happened and that the mom or dad or cousin or uncle or whatever had an issue, and they can still be in class in a sense that they can actually watch that recording. So I, like Regan, also record all of my material. I don't feel like some of my colleagues that I have got some kind of proprietary information that I haven't said a million times anyway in front of a classroom. And so for me, it also is freeing in a sense that if a student does miss the class, I can just say, hey, I posted the recording in Canvas. You can go ahead and look at it. And in interviewing some of those students after the class is over, or even during the class, I realize what they end up doing is they end up listening to me on triple speed. So for some of them, it's even more efficient to do it that way also, that they can actually start a recording and finish it in a record amount of time and still in their mind get as much of it as they did before. In addition to that, I've also put all my PowerPoints and all my notes up on Canvas also. So for me, I go into this knowing that, yes, there are some students who will decide never to come to class. I haven't seen those students yet. I mean, what I've seen is that it has been a mix of students. So one group comes all the time, another group comes, very regularly, but some things come up. And then, yeah, there is a third group, but they are so small in terms of never wanting to physically be in a classroom because they feel that this is okay. Like that nobody in my mind really feels that just watching lectures online and never coming to class and just doing the assignments. That's what I would say if you were an eCampus student, meaning we have something called external campus, which is, the online world where you take all your classes that way. Very few students are like that or desire to be that way unless they are in a situation where they have to be that way, place bound, or in a situation where life has caught them in a way that they can't be on the campus, etc. So that's not the preferred way. That's the way that people will choose if life happens. I think the majority of folks like to have the campus experience. Clearly, they don't like the driving experience. Clearly, they don't like the parking experience and all that on every campus. But I think most people want to come in. And so I think coming back to the role of the faculty, we have to be that person who puts aside the idea that learning can only take place in this fashion, which is I speak, you listen, you take notes. Even that's changed. I mean, the idea of taking notes is just so different now than when I was in class or when I was doing my undergraduate. They record you. They again, I call it the OSU, in my opinion, way, where they just shake their head up and down, and you don't know, am I speaking to somebody, or I always thought that you need to put something down on a piece of paper, but many of them seem to get it. So it's a different playing field. And I think that we as faculty need to embrace that difference in playing field and go with it, try to figure out ways in which we can harness the energy of the new classroom and be able to be in that situation where we are using all kinds of different electronics, in my opinion, that is now out there for us. Things like Top Hat and other software that actually allows us to interact with students on a different basis, and having students also produce assignments that are totally different. Assigning only a paper is one way. There are so many ways now we can actually assess students of their understanding of the material. So we can go into that later on. I'm sorry, I digressed a little bit. Yeah.
No, that's good. I do really appreciate a head nodder in class. It makes me feel like I'm being heard, if not completely understood or completely articulate. If someone's nodding their head, that's the person that I am quite thankful for in class. I don't know that I want to go here necessarily, but it seems to me like there's a undercurrent of fear that might be operating when faculty think about either posting their lectures online or doing more digitally enhanced classroom activities, whether that's peer instruction or classroom response systems, the stuff that we put broadly into the category of active learning. And also things like free range assignments, ungrading, specifications grading, these kinds of things that, as you were saying, Dwaine, the kind of classic model is this professor as the source of verified knowledge and wisdom and learning and so forth, and students as receptacles of that learning. So that banking model. So if you know your Freire, right, that's bad. We don't want to do that. On the other hand, the fear could be related to, quite frankly, loss of control and also fear of being either exposed or, being exposed as something less than an expert who has full kind of command over the classroom. Now, my next question is, I don't know if you want to address any of that. Well, let's do that. Why don't you have thoughts about either of that, Regan or Dwaine?
Absolutely, absolutely. I'm so glad you did. We didn't move because. So here's the thing, Dan. First off, I think yes, yes, and yes. Most of those fears, it's not just underlying; it's explicit in some cases. But the reason I wanted to jump in and make sure we tackle this one is because examining that question, right? Dwaine raised the issue. We're still doing things in the same old way. And actually, if I remember, Dwaine, one of the first things I loved was even in our proposal for this book, that was, one of the big things Dwaine put down really nicely. We can't just be doing lecture as usual, that things haven't changed forever, right? But here's the thing, Dan, to add to those fears that you talked about, here are some realistic issues, which is that the average faculty member, right? The average faculty member does not get pedagogical support and training. All right.
True.
So all the things you talked about, all the different, innovations and so on, how do you do it? How do you best do it? Right. And that's why what I love about part 2 and those 17 chapters is the role of centers for teaching and learning, helping faculty find ways to do these things. Because I think it is not surprising for a faculty member. I mean, myself, many years ago, if I time traveled, balked at the fact of recording a class and sharing it, balked at the fact of sharing PowerPoint notes, the old me, right? But, I looked at the research, I did some of the research, I chatted with Centers for Teaching and Learning, and you actually see that there's a very valid reason for doing it. That's why one of the things that I'm super proud of Oregon State Center for Teaching and Learning is we have a whole set of the big questions that faculty ask and answers with data. So, for example, should I allow technology in the classroom? Should I use online testing or open book testing? Should I share my slides or record my lectures? And for each of these very commonly asked questions that came up during the pandemic, we sifted and winnowed through the research on it and actually provided some empirically based answers. But I think that's a big deal. It's yes on the fear, losing control, how will I be seen? But I really think the bigger issue is I don't know how to do it. I don't know how to do it. I don't know if I should do it. And being able to open the conversation is key. And that honestly is what I think is one of the best things that making some lemonade out of lemons. COVID forced us to take a look at in-person teaching with a higher level of scrutiny than we ever have looked at it before.
And I want to add to that a little bit around the technology, even the faculty keeping up with the technology. And so, yes, we've got smart classrooms now, but ironically, I don't think they're even smart enough. I mean, there's so many other additives that could be put into static cameras in classrooms, being able to just push one button when you walk into a classroom and everything just happens and works, as opposed to you being the technology person that has to figure it all out every single class. And those become the deterrent for, I'm going to refer to us as older faculty. And I'm pointing to myself because, again, you turn a certain age and it becomes the fear, as Dan, you said, of looking like you're a fool on the stage. Because the students see you right away once they walk in the classroom and you're already there, or if you're coming in and rushing from another class, and they watch you fiddling and faddling and trying to get everything working. And that's a fear factor right there for the faculty, right? To try to get everything up and working. And then if you add to that you've decided that you're going to do this Zoom simultaneously, which I do. You've then got to make sure that Zoom is on, that that's working simultaneously, and that you've got the recording going. And then you can then start with everybody over here in front of you. So all those factors for some folks is just way too much to try to figure out. And so some folks just say, you know what, I can be one mode. And the mode is I'm right here in the class and that's it. I just think that the technology also needs to catch up in universities to really assist us. I know that Regan and I both teach in a very large lecture hall, and I've always complained about the lecture hall because the camera doesn't follow you in that lecture hall. It's a static, it sits in one part of the room. Yes, you can adjust a little bit around the focal depth of it, but imagine if you had a situation where you're wearing a mic and the camera follows the mic. It's moving with the mic. Wherever the mic is, it's going there. And it's AI enhanced where it's focusing in sometimes and sometimes it's focusing out. So the recording becomes a little better in a bigger sense of things than just some kind of, static where students will definitely only want to listen to the sound because they don't want to necessarily see you because there was such a crappy version of you being recorded in that lecture hall that it's really about the sound. So we got to get there.
Yeah. Okay. I think the idea of a camera following the speaker around makes some good sense. And of course, if you're still doing that lecture kind of thing, I mean, if you're looking at me in my lecture, I don't stand still almost ever. So
it's hard to stand still in front of a large group of people because you're also trying to find those people who are shaking their head up and down, like you said, Dan, is that you're moving towards those people. And then you realize that, hey, I can't only talk to this person. I better move and go somewhere else too to sort of engage different parts of the room. And I know Regan actually goes up and down the aisles. So,
oh yeah, me too.
So I'm just saying, different people, different styles. And right now, the technology in those classrooms is just monolithic, And I think that there's other technology that's around that universities need to really invest in the next level, next generation. We can't be sitting on our hands and saying, well, we'll wait till they start really complaining. I don't know if you remember, our university is old enough that I can remember that they only finally started changing desks and furniture in the classroom when things got really dilapidated. So we're 150 years old, and I could swear to you, I've taught in classes where the material in that classroom was probably at least 60 years old, what people sat on and so forth. And what they start to realize is the students had gotten bigger, and they couldn't even fit in the chairs. So it took them that long to figure out, hey, we got to do something different here in these classrooms because they're breaking tables, they're breaking chairs, and it's just the materials are 50 years old. And I just don't want us to get to that point again with technology because technology is moving so fast that administrators then decide, oh, it's X amount of years later, let's get new technology in those rooms now because what we did for COVID or we've upgraded, but we haven't upgraded.
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the things that you're pointing towards is the fact that we are not moving to a university where we only do things through recordings and through, video delivery and even not in person, but even like synchronous lectures. We are in a situation where, there are people in the classroom, they value the in-class experience. That's not going away. We certainly don't want to get rid of all of our lecture facilities or all of our classrooms and just build a bunch of, one-button studios where people walk in and hit a button and record their lecture. But at the same time, there is a need for flexibility in terms of access to course materials and lecture and some of these activities that can take place in class. Okay, well, we've talked about what folks are experiencing now. I want to move backwards in time. So when the pandemic really hit in around March, thankfully around spring break of 2020, we transitioned to Zoom. I was at this small liberal arts college. So we transitioned to Zoom after spring break. A small group of faculty and administrators worked really hard, I mean, almost heroically, I would say, over the summer to prepare for fall. We returned to modified classrooms in the fall of 2020 in person with masks and physical distancing. There were all these spray bottles of disinfectant that were used to wipe down tables and desks and things. One of our faculty members, this is a small school, so when one of our faculty members died of the virus, that was a significant thing that that happened, and many people had known him for a long time. That was an interesting situation. When restrictions were fully lifted in the fall of 2021, our campus moved on, but not all faculty felt the effects of the pandemic in the same way, as I think you were indicating earlier. So here's what you write in chapter 1. Adjunct faculty, early career faculty, women, and faculty of color, and obviously there's overlap between all of those categories, these folks face tremendous dysfunction in their career expectations and work-life balance as COVID-19 wore on beyond the 2020 spring term. Many of these faculty reported being particularly depressed, stressed, and burned out. And as of fall 2021, almost 9 out of 10 faculty surveyed agreed or strongly agreed, that's 54% agreed or strongly agreed, that their jobs had become more difficult, with 40% reporting that they were considering leaving the profession. So my question when I sent this to you was, how have faculty processed these losses? But I think I want to reframe the question and say, how have faculty processed these changes in their work lives, in their stress levels, in the relationship between their emotional lives and their work lives?
So I'll
I know it's a big question.
it is.
Can I tell you my answer? I don't think I have fully emotionally processed the COVID-19 era. And I think my personal process, and I have a ton of privilege. Let's just be very clear about that. So I can't imagine. I mean, I'm trying to imagine what it would be like for other people differently situated. I think it's going to take at least as long as the pandemic, and I think we're kind of still in it, to be frank, for me to come back to some sense of equilibrium in my scholarly, academic, and teaching lives.
Yeah, and so it's funny, Dan, because my first response was actually going to be in response to your question. I don't think many of us have completely gotten over it. I mean, every year has added something different that makes it slower. I mean, this winter here in Oregon, we had crazy ice storms. We lost a whole week of a quarter, and a quarter is only 10 weeks, and we lost a week. And there's always been something, going on. And so I think it's been very difficult to say, oh, it's one thing if all of us in higher ed got a bunch of time where we could do nothing. And whether you're on a 9-month contract or a 12-month contract, it's still really difficult to do nothing because of all the things we do. So I think that there's been that collateral damage that has just built up, and definitely that's the first part of it is it's still there, and it'll take a lot longer before we get past it. So
I'm going to add to that one of the things we don't want to admit on any campus is that we went through a trauma. And trauma is one of those things that you have to work through the various stages of coming out of it. And I don't think we've ever had that conversation on my campus about it being a trauma and that we need to work through the various stages of it. So I think that's one of the first starting points. A second aspect about this conversation, Dan, you brought up is that those minoritized faculty, women, people of color, low income, and first generation faculty have experienced the emotional work pre-COVID. In other words, they were doing emotional work with students pre-COVID. During COVID, they were doing a whole bunch of emotional work with those same constituents that would actually come to them via Zoom or just not participating in class, or they would come and you had to deal with them. In addition to that, you were dealing with your own family. In addition to that, you're also dealing with your colleagues. In addition to that, you're dealing with your own self. Self usually came at the very last part of that model. And, family came hopefully first, and then everything in between. But what I'm getting at is they felt that real squeeze, but the added squeeze of COVID really pushed a lot of people to think, I'm doing so much work right now in this career of academia, which when you think about your friends who are not in academia, who get to go home, let's say at 5 o'clock every day and can forget about anything about grading or forget about anything about the requirements of being a community member, being somebody who is doing stuff with students. What I'm getting at is it's often hard to explain to people who are in a non-academic world that our jobs, yes, they are 9 months, as you hear them. They say, wow, you get all those time off. It's like there's so many other expectations that are built into academia that in order for you to be promoted to the next level, you have to do all that hidden work that oftentimes is never necessarily recognized by your friends and colleagues. Sorry, your friend. When I say colleagues, I mean acquaintances, family never recognizes that. And that's okay. I'm not asking for sympathy, but at the same time, there's a whole other element that those minoritized groups take on in addition to the regular role of a 9 to 5 job. We take our jobs home. We take them into various aspects of our life, and we're always planning for the future because you need to have at least a year in advance of planning, sometimes 3 year or 5 year planning horizon for your life if you want to be doing projects. And we are required to do projects. Projects mean writing books, they mean writing articles, they mean writing. There's a whole other element that I think for some folks, once the pandemic hit and they saw another opportunity to, let's say, go into government industry or private industry with their PhDs, they said, you know what, I think I'm going there because the pay level is not great here. It's not as if you get, all kinds of, extra money. People always assume we make more than we do, et cetera. So all those became compounding factors for some folks to announce, I think I'm thinking about something different.
Yeah. And it just, Dwayne, you saying that just makes me think of an analogy I often evoke for higher education. Because of all those invisible asks and the invisible pressures, even before COVID, the average faculty member in higher education was going around like, imagine a glass absolutely full of water, and the surface tension is just keeping all the water in there, but the top is this convex, ready to spill. And that's how higher education seems always to be. And then COVID was that plunk in there that just, bam, that was it. Everything spilled out and everything spilled out. I mean, we were holding it together until then, but that surface tension can only go, those laws of physics and psychological well-being can only go so far, can only take so much.
Yeah. And I also want to contrast that too with the different faculty members that have existed in every department since time T. And that is, let's call them the full professors, the associates, and the assistants, and now the instructor pool, who has now increased dramatically on every campus. So each one of those groups has an option of doing their job and more. And so if I go to the very beginning of the spectrum, I would say instructors do their job and more. If I go to the other end of the spectrum, I would say that full professors have a choice of doing their job and more. They have a choice. It's a different kind of situation. So what I mean by that is when the pandemic hit, some of my full professor colleagues decided they were going to do their job. And that was it. They were not going to go beyond that for anybody or any situation. That was what they were going to do. And so that, in my opinion, ended up being a real bottleneck in the whole situation, because you've got the folks from behind, when I say behind, on the different part of the spectrum, pushing hard because they were teaching the huge classes. They were doing, yo man and yo woman service to try to keep this thing going. And then they looked north and they said, well, what's Professor X doing? He is teaching his niche class with 14 students in it, and he ain't looking like he's going to reach back and help me out here at all, or help the situation out. And Professor X never did. And so that was another tension that was going on in units, that you had these instructors and assistant professors and some associates, of course, trying to make this thing, really, really work. And it was full of tension because you did have that other set of folks who had the choice. And the associates had a choice too, but they were so into their career, mid-career, that they were, many of them were probably thinking, I better do something here because I need to be recognized. But there was also that tension too, Dan, of tenure clocks being slowed down or stopped. And that worked for many, but some other folks said, you know what, I don't care about a tenure clock. I'm going anyway for this next promotion. Don't stop my clock. I'm going to push on through. So it was a lot of things going on for different sets of people.
I think we'll probably have even more, hopefully we'll have more scholarship and research on this from our friends who study higher education as an institution. What are the impacts in terms of time to tenure, folks who decide to opt out of the tenure track and do an industry non-academic job. Those kinds of impacts, I think we're still going to be working on understanding for a while. And obviously there are financial implications and career implications for pausing one's clock. I mean, I don't know how it works at Oregon State, but at most places that I've been, there are incentives to go up as soon as financial incentives to go up as soon as possible in terms of changing your salary. And when we're talking about salaries that are not, let's say, exceptionally generous, an incremental increase that's compounded over, the next 10, 15, 20 plus years of one's career actually makes a difference over time. But you're right. I mean, on the one hand, you can say, that full professors who had much more flexibility in their decision making on how to respond to their workload in pandemic conditions, they were pulling less additional weight compared to they could pull less additional weight than their colleagues. Part of the social movement person in me says, work to rule is sometimes an effective strategy for illustrating some of the ways that workplaces are exploitative. And I think, y'all are nodding, and we know that higher ed is a greedy institution, right? And it's some greedier more for some than others. But these pressures are hard to avoid, no matter how privileged one might be. We can talk more about that perhaps at another venue. But I want to move on to talk about chapter 5 in your book. That chapter is about student responses to emergency learning conditions and how faculty did or did not pivot well. So you focus mostly so far on empirical responses, empirically verified teaching strategies. What does the research tell us about what students need and needed from their faculty under remote learning conditions?
Yeah. So what we we got the good news is that there was a lot of different ways to find out what was going on. I think earlier in this conversation, you alluded to the chapter and information that where Dwaine, spearheaded collecting data from faculty with the faculty pulse survey. And, we did a lot of student pulse surveys. And the big thing that came out with that student pulse was that at that moment in time, during emergency remote teaching, students really wanted more compassion. They said empathy, understand what we're going through, understand this is tough. And actually to answer your question even more broadly, the Center for Teaching and Learning, we pulled together what are these things that students really wanted. And, we found that they created a very useful acronym, which was COMFY. And students wanted compassion, they wanted more organization, right? A well-organized class. They wanted multiple facets to the class. They wanted flexibility and they wanted engagement. This was the time that they really needed to be engaged by the material and the faculty. So, those are my big five, compassion, organization, multifacetedness, flexibility, and engagement. And those are tough to do. And I think some of us did that all the while. But during the pandemic, it was a real need for that where it wasn't happening. And students told us that it wasn't happening in a lot of places. The percentages of, what percent of your classes would you blah, blah, blah. Those percentages were sort of low, but that's not surprising. Everybody was dealing with things.
So to echo that, I think a lot of faculty who had just been recycling year after year what they had been doing, and as you said, Dan, there was a major shift in 2020 of March. That was one shift. And then by the time we got to September 2020, that was another major shift, because by that point, you could have said to faculty, hey, you had the whole summer now. What are you bringing to these students? Because they're actually asking for what Regan just mentioned. And some folks just, didn't get it together because they were traumatized by COVID, and they had kind of shut down in the summer, and now fall was coming and they still didn't know what to do. So they just went back to recycling what they were doing before. And that caused the most amount of, in my opinion, disconcern among the students, because some of them were expecting, hey, you've had time. What do you got for me now? And I think as faculty, we need to be doing this constantly, is how do we bring the newest, the latest, the most innovative things from our discipline into our classrooms. But again, there's all those other pressures that people have, including publishing, attending meetings, producing papers, being in communities, be a community advocate. These are all the other parts of our job that most people don't see. And it's those parts of the job that you're also trying to be good at. And so what some can sometimes suffer for some people is the new material and the new things to be innovative and to be engaging in a classroom. And so I'm guilty of it too. I mean, I get so busy trying to do 5 different things all at the same time. And I know I don't even have to, I get teaching evaluations, but I know I don't have to even look at them now. And maybe you're at the same thing, because I know when a class went bad. I know when, the 10 weeks didn't work for me, because it just didn't work, because I had way too much going on. And yeah, the students can tell me that, and they tell me in all different ways. but I kind of know it. And I know when a class has gone really well too. So I think we need to, yeah, again, come back to that whole idea of comfort that we need to put into our teaching for our students.
Regan, one of that middle letter M for multi-dimensional, multifaceted. Can you help me understand?
Yeah. So the multifaceted one honestly really taps into a couple of different things. A large part of it, I will admit, taps into and evokes universal design for learning principles, gives students different choices. Even if you don't go the UDL way, from a motivational standpoint, or what we've seen from what motivates students, the more choice they have, the better. And what we found was when students felt that they had more choice, when students felt that they had different ways to access material, they felt classes were going better, and that's hence the multifaceted. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. So free range assignment, so getting at the same kinds of concepts. So just as an example, really concretely, when I teach social theory, the traditional thing to do is to have students write some kind of research paper, and that's fine. So they talk about some theorists' ideas and they apply them in a particular context, and they say, look, Du Bois explains this thing that's happening in 2023, and brilliant. If they can do that well, then awesome. They explain Du Bois's concepts and they show how they operate and so forth. So that shows a lot of facility with those ideas. The free range version of that is to say, all right, well, so take a person's ideas and extend them or apply them in other kinds of outcomes. Give me something else that does apply those
Yeah.
ideas. Show me Du Bois's concepts. It doesn't have to be in a 15 to 20 page double space research paper. It can be in the form of a creative debate between Du Bois and Weber or something like that. Or it can be thinking about those ideas and seeing how they operate in pieces of art or literature or music, and
Yep.
writing about the lyrics of some song as related to double consciousness, for example, or the color line, to extend the Du Bois example. So, or building a curriculum for another kind of audience. Basically the core outcome is the same, but the format of describing that or communicating those ideas is much more self-directed and hopefully highly motivating relative to writing
Yep.
another longish term paper.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So Dan, I'm going to build on that a little bit in that I tend to ask students to do different things. Like, for example, I have them build YouTube videos instead of writing papers, or I have them doing a film journal rather than just passively watching films, et cetera, et cetera. Building academic posters. These are all great things to do. But what I've also found for some of the students, it also off-puts some of them because they're so used to doing what you just said, Dan, writing the research paper, that my assignments then take them even more time that they never budgeted for. And so they'll end up then saying, can I have an extension? Can I have an extension? And you're starting to think to yourself, hey, I've actually made this actually a lot easier. At least I think so, right? A lot easier than writing a 10-page paper or 15-page paper, research paper. And I've actually asked you to use your creative energy. Well, their muscles for creative energy, I hate to use the word muscles, are kind of weak because they've never been asked. Yeah, that's right. They're just not. Yeah,
but they're not practiced.
They need to go to the gym for that. And so therefore, the innovative things that we want to put in, and I'm going to continue putting them in, are the ones that are hardest for them to fit into the 10-week schedule, because it's so different than the other 4 professors they have who've asked them to do very traditional things, and they're socialized to those things. The other thing becomes, I'm overwhelmed. Just putting that out there for this is a thought.
Yeah.
Well, but Dwaine, you're pointing to a very important phenomenon that actually relates to the thing you said, I think, about student evaluations of teaching, which is that you bring people into college who have been well socialized into one or two kind of modalities or styles or cultures of teaching and learning, and then you put them in an environment where faculty have, mostly for the good, in my view, quite a bit of flexibility in how they structure courses and the kinds of assignments and tasks that they give students, and the lecture style or the class format style. Everything from flipped classrooms to lecturing to simulations to games, peer instruction with clickers, et cetera, et cetera. And then we ask students, like, how do you feel about these classes? And sometimes at least there's a portion of students who say, this is not what learning looks like to me, and therefore I do not like it, even though the task that you've given them is much richer and the learning gains we theorize anyway, and there's probably empirical evidence for this, are actually much greater than might be possible with the standard set of relatively constrained assignment choices. Here's Before you respond to that, which I do want to hear you say something about it, y'all. You mentioned earlier Centers for Teaching and Learning, which are often really good resources. I've worked at several different colleges and universities in my career, thankfully. I have found that these vary quite dramatically, not necessarily in the desire to be helpful and supportive, but certainly in the resources devoted to that support. So let me just say there are places, without throwing shade on anybody, there are some places that I have actually worked, like Vanderbilt Center for Teaching, for example, which just got renamed, and I don't remember the new name of it. My apologies to Vanderbilt, that have an extensive collection of teaching guides that are empirically based. I've written one or two myself that help in a variety of ways, from the first day of class through tensions in the classroom, through when terrible things happen and you need to respond to them, and so on and so forth, perhaps similar to what you all do at Oregon State. And then there are others that are just completely overwhelmed and under-resourced. And that's not their fault necessarily as individual staff people or faculty who are working in these places. But it does speak to a couple of things that I just want to mention. One is that your Center for Teaching and Learning may not be super well resourced. That doesn't mean you don't have access through the wonders of the internet to higher quality resources at other places. So I'll mention Vanderbilt. Obviously, Oregon State sounds like there are some good resources there. Other ones that are well known, University of Virginia's Teaching Resource Center is another, and I'm sure I'm missing some. So this is not meant to be an exhaustive list.
Yeah, and that's it, and that's exactly it, right? It's I want to pull out from there. Yes, it's faculty vary in how much access they have, and yes, they can go out there. But again, right, it's tougher when with all the things you balance that we talked about before to go beyond what's just on your campus, is right. But I think there's something
No,
else
totally.
here that Dwayne was getting at, and even when we talk about these different assignments, is when students are so used to a certain way, when you try to do something innovative, unless you really make your philosophy clear and why they have to do it, you're right. They will take that out, in quotes, take that out on you on student evaluations, right? And it takes a savvy chair or department head to recognize that some of that flack is collateral damage from an attempt for innovation, right? And I'll also say, let's not forget that there are some enduring myths out there among students. I mean, what we've been talking about really taps into the big crazy myth of them all, that students will say, you know what? This person doesn't teach according to my learning style, right? And we debunked that in 2008, but it persists. And I think that's the big deal, where they go, I'm not that kind of learner. And then the instructor or the teacher who hasn't heard that learning styles has been debunked tries to bend, and adjust their teaching style to fit the sort of learning style, which is, we now know, it need not be done. Actually, should not.
I think there's an intersection here between what we've been saying. So between good teaching practice and
Yeah.
ways to kind of mitigate some of these issues. So the key word is transparency. So one key word is transparency. So, not only this is the assignment I'm giving you, but why am I giving you this assignment? What are the valuable things you're going to learn, or skills you're going to develop, knowledge you're going to acquire in the process of doing this? And then what does a good product look like? Like, what does success look like if I am asking students to do a free range assignment that results in a YouTube video that's a dialogue between Cartoon Du
Yeah.
Bois and Cartoon Weber? Like, if I don't know what that looks like and I'm a student, then I'm much more likely to say, well, let me just write the 15 pages. Even though I'm like, wow, I think it's a really creative idea, and like I really want to challenge myself to learn a new skill, to voice these characters and to put it up on YouTube and to share my take on how the conversation would go between these two people. By the way, these two people met in Germany and they met in the United States. So actually there was some information about this free idea. So But without that kind of framing and without being able to, without saying to students, you may have heard something about learning styles, and probably many of you think you're a visual learner or you're a auditory learner or something like that. And, that idea came from this person. And it turns out that was a very provocative idea. Like we wanted to think about that. And, because there's a whole field of folks who focus on learning, they're called cognitive psychologists, among others. Like they actually explored that. And here's what they found. It's really not a thing. What is a thing, and the key is not to just say it's not a thing, although that's important. It's what you follow it up with. So it's not a thing. And here's what's more effective. So what I'm going to do is the more effective thing because I care.
Also add to that, Dan, is that in everybody's classroom are different types of students. And the different type of students would be the traditional 19 to 23-year-old student who is full-time on campus, in a sense, may have a job and is doing their education. You also got first-generation students. You also got older than average students that are sitting in the same class, and you've got students with lots of responsibilities too, who are also young but may have lots of responsibilities. That could include care of parents and care of children, and et cetera. So what I'm getting at is that's the kind of playing field that you're playing in for many of us, and you can't only be pitching at the folks who you assume are going to be those students who have theoretically all the time in the world. And every ability to be innovative and so forth also involves them having to find other resources on campus too, like the media center. And, where do you build a poster from? That sort of thing. Having enough time to be able to do that is sometimes also something that we all know how students tend to do things, pushing it off. And then in the, 2 weeks before or a week before, they actually start getting into it. And that could be the detriment. So all those factors play out as we need to think through how we're assigning things, when we're assigning them, and what our expectations might be for different populations of students in your same classroom setting. And of course, we've been encouraging faculty now, and for the first time this year, I actually taught a new eCampus class. This is external campus. And the eCampus people have been encouraging us to do a mirror, in a sense, of what we do on campus. And I've started to realize you can't do a mirror because the resources aren't there for the eCampus students. Plus, that's another set of students who are in a diverse set of individuals who are dealing with all kinds of things. I mean, I've had folks, deal with the cancer, the dying pets, dying family members. It magnifies itself even more on eCampus that I didn't realize. The last time I taught eCampus was like 15 years ago. And so I developed one of the early classes. They had me redevelop it over this last year, and now I retaught it in 2024, just finished it in winter. And it's just been such a different experience because back then, it would just, when I first developed it, it was just you develop these modules and you let it go. Now there's just so much more expectation of doing all kinds of different innovative things within, recording lectures from beginning to end, having short lecture. I mean, it went on and on and on. I think it's a good product, but I still had even more issues with those students in my class this round than I can recall having 15 years ago when I first started doing this stuff as an early innovator of eCampus. So things have changed, and I think we need to also realize too, as teachers, that our classrooms, especially the ones we may have come out of and been exposed to for 10 years or 15 years, that whole thing it's very different now, especially with students having to have multiple jobs and multiple responsibilities. These are things that, and also another fact about students too, I've noticed too, Dan, is that they don't want to take on extra credits, meaning that they want to get, let's say you have to graduate at 180 credits. That's how many credits they want. They do not want any more because that means to them more money. And parents, yeah. And they're trying to, negotiate how to keep that debt down to as low as they can, which then means for us that when you do try and do innovative things like on Friday, I'm taking 20 students off to Aruba for a week class, study abroad. But when I started looking at the profile of these students, they were a very interesting set of profile of students because they're not like the students I would have had doing study abroad 10 years ago. So again, these things are changing, and we as faculty, teachers, need to realize the environment around us has changed dramatically. We need to get there, whatever that means.
Right. Well, I think it's a good segue to a question about the changes that you think are going to stick around. So your book argues that rather than going back to the sage on the stage and in other instructor-centered teaching styles, the pandemic has likely permanently altered our expectations for the delivery and modality and expectations for student engagement and quality. So which changes do you expect to stick around? And what does the evidence from COVID tell us about how helpful those changes are likely to be in improving student learning?
Yeah, I can tell you immediately one of the changes that I know in next to everybody I've spoken to, I've seen them make attempts on the following, and that is to provide more opportunities for students to comment on a class. And by that, I mean for every single class. One of the things that I noticed that has stuck around and that relates to that is this is when I was teaching the large classes and had to do emergency remote teaching, I used the chat box on Zoom. And immediately, I mean, I'm talking fall 2020, I taught 285 students on Zoom. And I kept the chat open. And the comments in the chat, I got more questions about the content of class and communication with the students than ever before. And when we went back to in person, I kept the chat open. And in the large classes, I had a TA monitor the chat. But what a great way for an introverted student, a shy student, a student who doesn't want to raise their hand in a big way, in a big class, do so. Now, that open chat was a game changer. It's a very, very different thing to go, a way to go. And it's the tip of the iceberg in saying, okay, hey, look, here's a one way to provide a student to make more, communicate more. What are the other ways? And I think that's what I'm seeing a lot more of. That's one big change is finding more ways for students to comment synchronously or more in general. The second big thing I think is some really significant changes and some deep thinking about flexibility and how you can be flexible. I'll give you my favorite example. This is something a colleague and friend tried that I then modified and used as well. What she told students is, look, stuff happened in life, and if I have a deadline and it's coming up to the deadline and you can't make it, fill out this online form. And by just filling out this extension form, you automatically get an extension. You don't even have to tell me what the reason is, but you fill it out, you get an extension. And it's all automatic. And she has a little Google form that she pastes on her learning management system. And students, and I use this in my big classes now, students love it. Students absolutely love it. And in case you're wondering, do students misuse it and fill out extension forms all the time? Absolutely not. You know, which is the neatest thing. I mean, it is apologetic when they fill it out. There's the, oh, I wish I didn't have to, but this stuff happened. And mind you, again, I say you don't have to tell me. You can allude, you can even not mention, I'm going to trust you. But yet, they want to say this is what's going on. And very, very, I mean, out of a class, actually, I'll give you exact numbers since we are during finals week of our quarter. This term, winter 2024, 281 students enrolled, and 2 out of the 281 filled out more than one extension form. 2.
Mhm.
So, yeah, those are the two big ones that I see. Yeah.
A couple things I have put in play since COVID happened, and now I put it in a classroom. Things like discussion boards. So discussion boards came out of eCampus a long time ago. That was their innovation. I've actually put that in play now for all my classes that students can, well, not can, they have to participate in the discussion boards for class. In other words, I'll start the stimulation and then they participate in it. I've also innovated with Top Hat. So the Top Hat is just one piece of software. There are many others. Mentimeter is also another one I use too in classroom quite a bit. But that allows me to do polling right away. It allows them to have an opinion right away, and it allows them to see their opinions coming up on the screen. And these become ways of engaging students. But you have to come up with the right question. I mean, that's the pedagogical part. You just can't come up with dumb questions. You just can't come up with things that look like you're trying to fill in. Mm-hmm. Also doing quizzes in class through these innovative software that allow me as a faculty member to do, I call it passive grading, which they also call it, which means that whatever score they get just drops in the grade book. So I don't have to, back in the day, I used to use pen and paper, for quizzes. That all means that I can do it much more efficiently. The other one that I discovered too during pandemic was, of course, open book exams, which I don't do. But what I've done is actually brought all of my exams now through Canvas, which means that I can bring them all together in the same room.
Mhm.
I can say the exam's going to open at 6 o'clock. It's going to close at 8 o'clock. You're all in the same room. Go for it. The exam is opened. For me, this has been great because I didn't know it existed before. It automatically gets graded. I can see the scores as they come in. They're in the same room. I have the policing of what a lot of people worry about. It's open, what they can use their books if they have to do it at their own homes. So I've satisfied myself, but I've also satisfied them. And I've also reduced the amount of paper that I'm actually using because I'm now doing this on campus, in class. And the beauty of it all, too, is if some student at the last minute says, oh, Granny just died, I can say, okay, we'll join the exam at 6 p.m. like everybody else. I'm going to assume that you're not going to have open book. And ironically, in the couple of quarters since then, I've never noticed, for example, that Granny died and their score went from whatever to like off the chart. Never happened. They got the same average score they'd gotten had Granny not died, right? So to me, those small things become an opportunity for students to have choice in a sense, like different choices, but it also gets them much more involved in my teaching that I wouldn't have had, in my opinion, prior to COVID. So small things.
I mean, I think one thing that I've just noticed is that, for the vast majority of our students, my students, they actually want to learn stuff. They are interested in being efficient with their studying. They're not super interested in just taking courses just purely to like fill their time, for example, because they're bored. I mean, very few of our students seem to be bored. They have many things to do, but they seem almost exclusively, almost entirely, just very desirous of learning. And in part because I think they know the stakes of being in college and paying the tuition bills and the consequences of staying in versus not staying in. But also many just they genuinely value what it is that they're learning in class. Now that varies from class to class and professor to professor, but it's extremely rare that I would have a student who would who would cheat, or take advantage of the trust that has been offered and has been received through the course of the class. So it's a relationship thing. It's not immediate, but there's
Mhm.
a new book by Joshua Eiler that just came out about grading practices, and I haven't read it, but my understanding is focusing a lot on what happens when you actually trust students and treat them as people with complex lives instead of just a passive recipient of one's education or training. So in any case, just a plug for that. And Josh Eiler, if you want to come on the annex, I'm here for you.
Yeah, as I was going to say, Dan, one of the things I also discovered, and I think Regan also just has known this for years, is that in the first quarter, first term of a student entering university, that is the most important quarter for them, because if you set a bar for them that's actually innovative, creative, and so forth, they will come back to you. And I've had this happen for years now consistently. And they'll say, your class was the best class I've had. And I've been here for 4 years because you cared. You showed that you were doing innovative things. You didn't mind grading 100 papers, which I do. You set activities for them in their intro class that they never had again. Professors set those observations or doing things outside the classroom. And I also find that set of students are the ones that I also enjoy teaching the most too, because they're up for it. They have heard that college is going to be harder. They have heard that it's not going to be easy there, and they heard that the professors are going to be really challenging you and doing innovative things. And when you do that for them, their eyes open up for many of them, right?
Yep.
So clearly there are some in that classroom who say, what the hell is going on? And they're usually the ones who are taking their intro sociology class 2 years into their career. They're not first year, first quarter, first term, first time on campus type of students. And so to me, I think that's where when they take intro psychology and intro sociology together, and I've heard my students doing that because Regan and I both teach at the same quarter every year, that first, and they say, "Oh, you two are doing really great things. I really enjoy my two classes." so,
Yeah.
so again, it's who we put in front of them for that first year experience. And I think that's a big thing because one of the things I've observed is that many universities have put their instructors in those first year, first term kind of classes because they think they're the larger ones. They don't want to, burden the full professors, and the full professors don't even step up and want to do that. They think they're out of touch. All those kind of things come up with full professors. in their thinking process. Their hearing is going, their eyesight's going. I mean, all kinds of things going on. That's not the person to put in front of those students. I'm saying, though, if you've got folks who have an innovative mind and a desire to do a little bit of work, that's the people you want to put in front of those students to engage them, to make them into majors. I've had students come to me and say, I really wish I could be a major in this area, but I can't because my parents would kill me. Or that, there's no job prospects here because I want to be an engineer and I really want it, but I really love the stuff you're doing here. Right. And this is the kind of stuff that I think that I would do really well at. And I'm doing really well in your class, but this will be it. And the same thing likely for psych and the same thing for sociology and those disciplines that are the ones that are, they'd never thought about the world that way before. Sure, they thought about a math problem and that has an answer to it. But the questions I'm asking about abortion or gun control or, life is stuff they've thought about, they have an opinion about, but they've never heard the other side of it, or inequality or gender relations or sexuality issues, all stuff they want to talk about, but not necessarily they can actually major in that because, as I said, they don't see that as a career option.
Well, it's a big challenge that we have here. The University of Alabama at Huntsville is primarily known for its engineering and aerospace engineering and other kinds of STEM disciplines. And you're not alone in having heard that particular comment. So I want to ask one more question before we get to our banter segment. One theme that seems to emerge and reappear in several of the chapters in your book is communication. Can you give us an example of a campus that managed communication particularly well during the pandemic, and what helped that campus succeed?
I will have to say, starting from what we experienced, I think there was a level of coordination here at Oregon State that I think helped communication to a large extent. So first off, I guess I'll be explicit and say, I think Oregon State did a great job of communication. I think you look at some of those chapters, you'll see some other places where it was some of it good, some was not so good. But here, I think it was an excellent job, and I'll tell you why. Actually, part of it is my friend Dwaine Plaza, who was faculty senate president, who made sure there was good communication. But something I am very proud of when I look back almost 4 years ago to today, right, is the fact that there were all the key constituencies at the table. I think that's where Dwaine and I really got to know each other because we weekly, sometimes multiple times a week at meetings where it was, the administration, the faculty senate, the Center for Teaching and Learning, student support services, legal, everybody who was running different areas of the campus were at the table together on these calls. So that is the big takeaway is what's the structure for decision making and is everybody at the table? And the answer was everybody was at the table at Oregon State that I think nicely led to making sure, Dwaine was making sure there were faculty pulse surveys. Claire Creighton, who has a chapter that you alluded to, chapter 5, they were making sure that there were student pulse surveys, Oh, it was for a tough time, it was a good take on a bad time.
Yeah, I agree with Regan in that people were running into the fire rather than running away from the fire. And that was the difference with we call it the KEG, which is just basically a COVID planning team, and meetings all the time. Again, part of that likely is because our provost was a planner. Like that's his discipline. He is a PhD with planning. And so when COVID broke out as an issue, he already had in mind what he was going to prepare and who he's going to kind of create as a communication network. And he brought us all together and then created teams around just communication. And so he did a phenomenal job. As I said before, he came to his office every single day. He was the only one. But at the same time, that was one of the reasons why we had good communication. So everybody knew what was happening. You recall this, Dan, but George Floyd was going on at the same time, right? The murder of George Floyd. We had Black Lives Movement taking place right at the same time. We had campuses in an uproar over content and what was happening on campuses. All that was going on during the pandemic. In addition to, of course, just keeping campuses going, and in particular, just trying to find our way to limp along in a sense. There were clearly some universities who did better than others. I think if I were to look at it, the elite universities like the Harvards and the Berkeleys and so forth, they kind of didn't really. I mean, I had friends at those places. They kind of just shut down in a sense, right? They just said our students will figure it out. We'll just operate this, and we won't necessarily have lots of communication. We'll just get by. Whereas at our small state universities and maybe the small privates, man, we had to figure things out on our own real fast because we didn't have all the resources, that some of those bigger ones had, that they could just rely on people doing it a different way.
Yeah, I imagine Harvard and Princeton and other folks in that tier didn't exactly lose applicants on the basis of the education that was offered in the under emergency conditions and even in the fall of 2020 and the spring of 21 and so forth. Anyway, well, someone can consult the record and the data and see what the empirics are of that. Well, I want to move to our banter segment. Dwaine, you mentioned you're taking students to Aruba, and we also had some earlier email communication of you being in the Caribbean. And so today you appear especially bright and sunny, relaxed. So where in the world is Dwaine Plaza?
I am currently in San Diego waiting for the Pacific Sociological Association conference to begin. I came here early to help out the president and the executive director as needed. So they're getting here today. I only got here last night because I have grading to do, and I have tons of grading to do because I did teach an online class in the wintertime. As you said, I took the opportunity with this new structure that we're in to go and be in an extended time in Trinidad. And I was doing research there while I was also teaching online the full time I was there. I was holding all meetings, doing everything via Zoom and so forth. So that's another innovative aspect of COVID that allows faculty to do things a little more differently than they had in the past. In the past, if you go on a sabbatical, you're on a sabbatical and you turn off the volume and you basically just do your thing in your own research. This was a situation where I could be doing research in somewhere else at the same time continuing to do all my meetings and so forth because they were actually offered. 90% of my meetings were actually offered on Zoom in some kind of innovative way, right? So in other words, I could be at department meetings, committee meetings that I was still part of, et cetera. So again, these are all the things that we dreamt about when I first started my career. And now they're kind of coming to fruition about being able to be in different places at different times. What trapped me in a sense or tripped me up was the time zone changes, because I was 4 hours ahead of everybody else, which meant that I was staying up really late at nights to do other meetings, or sometimes meetings got clashed. But overall, though, taking students, I'm bringing 12 students here with me. So 12 students are coming from my university. They're flying in tomorrow. I'm picking them all up at the airport. They'll have the PSA experience, but I'll leave on Friday and I will then head to Aruba to meet 20 different students who we've been we've been courting them and we've had meetings with them. They're going to sociology and biology of Aruba class for a week. Then I'm coming back and teaching 3 classes. So the spring was going to be murdered.
But before the 3 classes, though, you get all the beaches in the world, and that even emailing with Dwaine is nice because you know that he's typing from some beach somewhere, and
I wish, Regan. I'm usually in a room somewhere suffering because it doesn't have air conditioning because I'm in my father's house.
yeah, yeah,
I hear
no.
you. I hear you.
Well, we can all be a little jealous of Dwaine Plaza's globe-trotting experiences. And well, Dwaine, you and I know each other from PSA, and it's been great to work with you on the council over these
Yeah.
past, feels like a while. We won't say how long it feels like, but looking forward to seeing you later this week in San Diego. And of course, your meeting as president of PSA is coming up. Where's the 2025 meeting, Dwaine?
It's going to be in San Francisco. So looking forward to bringing the group of scholars to San Francisco again. We've been to San Francisco many times as an association, but I want to bring some twists to it. And I want to do a little more community outreach in San Francisco where the association gets more engaged with established NGOs that are in San Francisco. I want to create situations in San Francisco where students and faculty are going out, maybe doing some volunteer work while we're there, some tours and some other activities of different aspects of San Francisco, like the Castro, which people hear about but never necessarily go down to, or Alcatraz, where people have heard about but never. Again, I like to think about a conference as beyond just a bunch of people sitting in a conference hotel and just exchanging papers and ideas. I'm going to try and figure out ways of creating more community into PSA because all of us here have been to conferences where the room is actually empty and yet we don't allow anybody else in from the community. In other words, there are 6 people in the room, 3 presenting and 3 in the audience. There are 3 friends and they're doing their best to try to keep it lively. Well, what happens if the PSA decided, hey, you know what? We could actually have other people in the room and they may be able to come in for free in a sense or a discounted rate. But the point is, let's get those rooms full. We have these great facilities and conferences that often go unused. But at the same time, let's figure out ways of getting our constituents, which are our students and our faculty who come to conferences, doing different things beyond just the walls of the conference and just networks. So I'll be presenting all that, I guess, on Friday to try to, hype up the conference a little bit. And to my theme really is going to be about what's happening right now with anti-DEI and the issues we're facing as faculty teaching on campuses, many campuses. I know your campus for sure, Dan, where there's been a retrenchment of what faculty can feel comfortable in having academic freedom on, and also watching on your campus, likely, Dan, more so than ours at this point, but ours could be heading the same way, where there's a real backlash on campus about students learning critical race theory, or students just learning about criticalness in their world that they live in. And you may face this too, Dan, where you've got engineers or science type people who really need this kind of door opening for them, where they can actually start to feel a sense that, hey, you know what, I can have my language of science, but there's this whole other world taking place over here that I can neglect by only looking this way, or I can look around and actually see what's happening behind me, at the side of me. My project that I'm doing, my bridge project, or I'm building a dam or whatever I'm building or overseeing in the future, has sociological implications to it. And if we don't teach that kind of stuff now to them, or at least they want to learn it, believe it. I mean, we all know that they want to learn it, but when we stifle them and don't actually even offer it to them, that's where I think we stultify their learning and become the banking model, as you talked about before, the public fair, just top down. I digress.
Well, I'll just put in a plug as we're winding down here for the Pacific Sociological Association annual meeting. The PSA is I'm biased, I'm the treasurer right now, but the PSA is one of the most welcoming conferences to early career students, early career folks, early career faculty, undergraduate students, graduate students. I think there's concerted effort for many years, decades really, to cultivate an environment that supports folks who are developing their knowledge, their presentation skills through undergraduate roundtables, through poster sessions, through allowing real space for folks to work out ideas across one's career, early or mid or late. And so if you're looking for a place to present your ideas and to build community with folks who are in the Pacific region and beyond, then PSA, take a look at PSA.
In contrast to ASA, which is the American Sociological Association, which is the conference that has thousands of people at it. And I think that Dan's been there, I've been there, and you just feel so lost. Nobody knows your name. Nobody will want to know your name unless you're a big name. And you just feel that sense of you've gone to a major conference, you've gone to a major city, but by the end of it all, you kind of feel, at least me anyway, what have I done here, accomplished? What networks have I made? I feel like a really small fish in a big ocean here at the ASA. It's an important conference to eventually present at some point in your career, but you will not get the same feeling as you get at the PSA or some of the other regional conferences that take place for sociology. That's been my bias.
Gotta love the regionals.
Yes, and please support them. All right, well, thanks to you both so much for your work on this book. I know it was a intense labor in a challenging time, and I hope it really, reaches the right kinds of people who are thinking